But fair enough. I probably agree. I just wouldn't want to say it out loud. This is the One Accord Podcast, and we are back together again for another episode in our Biblical Theology project. This time, Lord willing, we are planning to finish the book of Deuteronomy, tackling chapters 31 through 34. And last week, we didn't have our full team, and as a result, I think we were probably able to tie everything up in a nice, tidy little bow, but we do have the band back together, and so here once again to muddy the waters is Brother Micah. Micah, how's it going?
I'm doing well, ready to sling some mud.
We would have it no other way. Well, we certainly did miss you last time, my friend, and it's great to have you back. Brother Greg, how you doing today?
Doing great. Bought a new chainsaw this weekend, so I'm ready to chop down Micah's idols. And
oh my! I thought you were. Yeah, I thought you were going somewhere else with that, but that was pretty good.
That's where I went.
Brother Eric, how you doing today?
I'm not sure how to follow those responses. I'm doing fine. Looking forward to, in a way, looking forward to finishing Deuteronomy because that means we're getting into new territory, and I'm always open to exploring new territory.
You didn't make any purchases this week? No chainsaws.
Oh
no!
Chainsaws. Had I known Greg bought a chainsaw, I would have bought a better one. But I didn't. I did not know that he had bought that. So,
and you'd be way more excited about using it.
Oh.
Way more enthusiastic.
Yeah. Well, Eric
as always goes without saying.
Stop.
Well, if this is your first time watching this show, it's not always this silly. We're just excited to have everybody back together again. But we do want to get into this material. There's a lot to talk about in these 4 chapters, and we're not going to be able to talk about every single detail, but we will focus on that which stands out the most to us. So if you haven't read Deuteronomy 31 through 34 in a while, maybe press pause right now and just give it a quick read through so that you will be aware of everything that's in here, just in case maybe we skip something that you would have wanted to talk about. And then you can let us know in the comments below what you think about that. But who wants to get us started with an observation or a question from Deuteronomy chapter 31 today?
Yeah, I'll start us off. In verse 6, God said that he would not forsake his people. And this seems absolute. It seems concrete. But then later he told Moses that he would forsake them if they disobeyed him and turned to idols. So verse 6, he says he wouldn't forsake them. In verse 17, he says, when they forsake me, I will forsake them. So my question to you guys is, how do we reconcile these two seemingly inconsistent statements?
This is just like every other supposed contradiction that we've talked about before, and I imagine it will be just like everyone will talk about, that God's not using these terms at the same time and in the same sense. So he's telling them, making them a promise as they go into the land, which they, a previous generation was worried about. I won't forsake you in this process. I will do exactly as I've told you that I will do. The other comment is made in a completely different context. Once God hasn't forsaken them in bringing them into the land and they turn their back on him, if they turn their back on him, he will forsake them. So he's talking about different things. It's different contexts. The word is the same, of course, but as we've discussed, it might seem ad nauseum to some of our viewers, but it is important to bring up every time that it's necessary. I'm not annoyed by the question. I know it seems like the answer is almost, at least from my end, almost always identical. Yes, it's the same word. No, it's not being used in the same context. So no, it's not a contradiction because words have the flexibility to be used in different ways when they're being used in different contexts.
Amen.
I have nothing to add to that.
Wow, I hit it out of the park, I guess, for that first one.
As usual.
You gave word for word my answer.
Nice. I was reading over your shoulder, testing, just like I was back in high school. Yeah. Eric, you got anything to add on that since you're asking the question?
I just want to just add a few things just quickly here, and I don't disagree with what you said. Context is the first thing you need to consider, and it's obvious that the context is different in both of these instances. God would not forsake his people as long as they remained faithful to his covenant. He would not forsake them when he brought them into the land to take possession of the land. But if Israel was unfaithful, and the expression is used, playing the harlot with the false gods of the Canaanites, which means turning away from God and worshiping other gods, false gods. And also, God did not mean that he would forsake them forever. As we read in earlier chapters, he agreed to forgive them if they repented and turned back to him. And we have to remember this is mentioned in a corporate context. He's talking about the nation as a whole, and he's saying, if you as a nation turn away from me, there's going to be consequences. But if you, again, the offer is always on the table. If you turn back to me, then I will forgive your sins, and I'll be joined to you again in a sense.
All right, well, let's move on. In chapter 31, verses 9 through 13, unless I'm mistaken, if you guys can recall, please correct me. This is the first place where we see an instruction given regarding the people gathering specifically for listening to the law, the Pentateuch, all that they've had of Scripture read. Now, I don't doubt that perhaps to some extent that happened as part of the regular festivals and stuff. But this, again, if I'm wrong, correct me, this is the first place that they are to gather and they are listening to the law be read. And it's done only, once every 7 years, which to me seems pretty infrequent. Once every 7 years. Any thoughts on the frequency of that? If the frequency with which all the people are going to be exposed on a regular basis to the law?
I'm not sure if this is the only time when all the people are exposed to the reading of the law. I do think that, however, there is a less. How am I trying to say this?
I don't know.
There's
I have no idea.
less frequent kind of gathering, or that the pattern that we see in the Old Covenant gatherings is less frequent. It tends to be more annually focused, and then there's these things that aren't even annually. It's every 7 years, etc. And there does seem to be a particular emphasis on the hearing of God's law in association with these great events. However, this is also an incredibly oral culture. They probably did not, like the average person probably did not have copies of God's word in their home. So they would have been probably more accustomed to hearing and memorizing than we are today. And we've already seen the instruction from fathers for fathers of children to speak about these things to their children constantly. So if someone were to come to me and say, well, how important really is the exposure to God's word? Because in the Old Covenant, they weren't even being constantly exposed to it. Well, it's not exactly true. I know it's not what Greg is saying, but if someone were to say that, that's not exactly true. Fathers were told to be constantly talking about these things to their children. I think that implies that as they're hearing these things, they're storing them up in their heart, they're committing them to memory, and they're talking about them with their children. So there's a constancy of instruction, but it comes in a different form or a different way.
Yeah, I would think that Deuteronomy 6 admonition, encouragement, exhortation, however you want to describe that is the ideal model, that includes every day people are talking about at least portions of God's word. From what I recall, certainly with the appointed times, it seems like that was required only for the males on a normal year. But maybe you would have left most everybody else at home. So then every 7 years, you weren't giving everybody like a whole lifetime of never hearing it from the primary source themselves, or only hearing it from the males of the household. That this was the whole family. So that's the uniqueness of this. But I would think that people were, just like you said, Micah, more saturated than we might imagine. Even though it is probably true that most of them didn't have their own copy of the law or something like that. So this would be bigger exposure to everybody. On a calendar basis, but that doesn't mean that the kids were only hearing about God's word once every 7 years or something like that. That in our modern practice, people who go on just Christmas or something are on a much better schedule because they're going 7 times in 7 years as opposed to once every 7 years. I don't get that picture here.
Yeah, what you guys said about Deuteronomy 6 is exactly what I was going to say. I had that in my notes, and I was thinking too that if the entire moral law is summed up in the Ten Commandments, and you have the Ten Commandments memorized, which wouldn't really be very hard to do. I mean, there's 10. It's not like there's 600. So if you only had the Ten Commandments memorized, that would be something that would be really easy to talk about all the time, every day, going over it with your kids. I mean, so to me, like, I think Deuteronomy 6 implies that they were in some way exposed to the law regularly, that allowed them to continue talking about it regularly, every single day, even is what the ideal was. And so that's kind of the way I saw it. I guess like, do they need to talk about, the ceremony that's involved for the purification of a priest or something all the time? Well, no, not necessarily. But are the Ten Commandments something they need to talk about every day? Yes. And so I think it'd be very easy to keep the Ten Commandments in mind and talk about those every day, if that is kind of the focus of what they need to do.
Fair enough.
All right. So I have another question. In the beginning of the chapter, Israel is commanded to trust and obey God as they cross over into the Promised Land and fight against the Canaanites. But in verse 16, God tells Moses that Israel will eventually worship other gods and forsake him. In other words, Israel's commanded to obey God, even though God already knows they won't, at least not forever. So what are your guys' thoughts on this? Why would God tell them to do something that he knows they're not going to do? And this is similar to what we've talked about in the past. Like, does God really expect them to follow the law? Why does he give them commands if they're not going to follow them? Are there really different future paths that they can follow? So, because to me, as I read this, I thought that maybe this would lend some support to what Micah had said. So, we'll let you start, Micah.
We've talked about the conditional passages, the conditional commands, where it seems like God is saying to these people, or he is saying to these people, if you do this, I will bless you in these ways. If you do this, I will curse you in these ways. And they have a genuine option about whether they're going to obey or disobey. Now, you have to say, okay, well, does that apply to every generation of Israelites? Well, yes, I think it is intended to apply to every generation of Israelites. But here in chapter 31, it appears that God has certain knowledge, absolute knowledge, of at least some generation in the future that is not going to obey. Now, you could say, like, if God had absolute certain knowledge of this, then there was no real possibility of them obeying these things, because it wasn't open, because God absolutely knew that they were not going to obey these things. I just don't think that's the best accounting for all of the biblical data. I think that God knows absolutely that at least there's a coming generation, and I think he knows exactly what generation it is, what people are going to comprise that generation, what they are going to do. I think he knows it absolutely. It's 100% certain. And I still think that those conditional phrases, if they would have obeyed him, they would have been blessed. And if they disobeyed him, which they were gonna, they would be cursed. So, like, I don't know how someone reads chapter 31 with all of this people will language. It's not like I think they're gonna, it's not I anticipate that they might.
But I think the question, Mike, the question is did God ordain that from eternity past, right? Like I think that's where the question lies in.
The question is broader than that, because we talked about both views of foreknowledge, my view and Eric's view of foreknowledge, which both are absolute foreknowledge. Like, there's not the openness that we've talked about with some other views. I know I'm not like accusing anyone of open theism here, but Joe said a couple conversations ago that he's not afraid of the word openness.
I would probably prefer the word multiple, but just because of the connotations of it. But
got it.
Yeah.
So we talked about my view, which obviously, like, there's distinctions between my view and Eric's view about how God gets this knowledge, right? But in both views, there's absolute knowledge, and it's fixed. It's fixed once God knows that something is going to happen. It seems like that's the kind of reality that is being communicated in Deuteronomy 31. Even if you take it outside of the realm of God's decree, even if you take it outside of that realm and just put it in the certainty of his foreknowledge, that God knows for certain these things are going to happen, and it's fixed and it's immovable that these things are going to happen. Even if you just talk about it in that realm, that seems to fit what is being said in Deuteronomy 31. And I don't think the conditional statements would be a contradiction to that.
Now, you said earlier, and I maybe I misunderstood you, but it sounded to me like you said that, and we both agree that God absolutely knows what these people are going to do in the future. He knows what generation is going to do what. So you and I are in agreement with that. But you said something like, the conditional statements still are true in those situations. Like there is a generation that will disobey. God foreknows they will disobey, and so because He foreknows it, it's fixed. And I would agree that in one sense that is true because he foreknows what they're going to do, and He's not wrong about that. But this is, I thought it sounded as if you had said, but if they had done differently, like if that disobedient generation had chosen to obey, then things would have turned out differently. Is that, would you still hold that position that things could have turned out differently?
So there was a possibility for what it was possible for them to obey then?
On the creaturely plane, contingency exists. On the God plane, I don't think contingency actually exists. I don't think there's contingency for God. I think there's contingency for creatures.
What about the vegetable plane? Is there a vegetable plane on which something else can happen?
So, I'm just talking about the creator-creature distinction, which we all agree with, I think.
Yeah.
Contingency exists for humans, so I can if you're communicating with me, hey, do this, don't do this. Well, if I do this, there's going to be a better outcome, and if I don't do this, there's going to be a worse outcome. That can be true even if God infallibly foreknows what will happen.
I agree. Of course, if they did something different, it would have been different. I asked Greg a similar question a long, long time ago when we were talking about free will. Same thing. Of course, I agree. It would be different. If God said something like, well, if I made a circle a square, then a circle would be a square. You're like, great, but you didn't. So could a circle ever be a square? Or if He said, if I made you with wings, you could fly. Well, sure. If I had wings, I could fly, but I don't. So what I'm hearing is, of course, if the world was different than it was made, then the world would be different. That's a tautology. Of course, that's true. But could it be that way? And I think that the view that you're ascribing, it devolves into saying, well, of course it could be. If God made it different, it could be different. Nobody could disagree with that. But these choices that He's saying, choose this, if they couldn't ever choose something, that's where I start to go, well, it seems like He's really telling them that they could do something that not just theoretically, if God made things different, would be different, but actually could be different based on the choices that they're making. And those are not the same thing at all. And yet, with that, and with that distinction I make, I agree with you. Of course, I don't think that this passage that we're looking at right now is untrue. I would not indicate anything different than the fact that God does know going into this that the people will turn away. He's telling them, and we'll see that this will happen exactly as God said. Of course, it won't be everybody, I don't think. There will be a remnant that will remain. I'm probably getting close to demerit territory with saying things like that. And when God chooses to bring judgment, of course, is all according to His sovereign purpose. We'll probably see early on that people will turn away and God will be very patient with them. And so when He chooses to bring judgments, again, how He's interacting with His creation, He has the ability in His sovereignty to bring about His ends whenever He wants to. But I just don't think that I read a statement like this as being so absolute. Like He's not. There are times, we all agree with this, when God will be very specific. It will be exactly this much time, or it will be exactly in this place. And He can make that happen. There are other statements like this where He's just saying, you will turn away, and when that happens, I will turn my back on you. That is a little bit more, again, I'm not going to use the word open because it's a little looser than I think maybe you're demanding that it be read. And I don't mean demanding in any kind of hostile way.
I have a question about that. So when He says this to them, do you think that God has certain knowledge of the generation that will turn away, how they will turn away, the individuals that will be involved with it, exactly what they will do? Yes. And do you think that there's any possibility, because God, and does He know it infallibly? Does He know it certainly? Yes. Is there any option for it to be different, really? Or how does that not reduce your whole situation to a tautology then?
It's a legitimate question.
I'm not trying to be obtuse. Maybe I am being obtuse, but I'm not.
I don't think you can try.
The intent isn't that anyway. Yeah, that's fair. That's fine.
I'm not. Once again, I'm not trying to be unkind or uncharitable. But so when I read, I'm okay with the I don't know answer about some things.
Yeah.
My I don't know answer says, okay, there's genuine responsibility, and these people can choose to obey or they can choose to disobey. And God says he knows exactly what they're going to do. I think that falls within the realm of God's decree. And I don't exactly know how to get the pieces together from a creaturely perspective. That's where I say I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm not comfortable saying I don't know about like whether God knows a certain thing.
Right. So this is I have to go back to our definitions, which is what where all this goes. And everybody that I talk to, I don't view you as being obtuse. It's probably a lack of my ability to communicate clearly what I'm trying to articulate. And I realize that often, not just with this issue, anytime we're talking about theology, politics, whatever, people can talk right past each other because we have different foundational definitions that are not in agreement. So I understand, I think, the objection that you're raising or the question that you're asking. And again, I don't view it as being obtuse. It is based on the fact that knowledge in the way that you are using it requires that there is no, God. I remember a professor a long time ago wrote on a paper that I was writing in college when I just I first started talking about these things like 20 years ago. And his objection was God knows. He knows. And I'm like, well, that's not your objection doesn't mean anything. What does that mean that he knows? Like, what does that word mean? And so if we define knowledge as God knows infallibly, absolutely, particularly every single minute detail, every movement of every quark, every orientation of every blade of grass at every moment of time. If that's how we're defining knowledge, then yes, what I'm saying is bizarre and heretical and insane. And it does make a lot of the passages that we read where God's saying things could be differently, or he's saying if you acted differently, it does seem disingenuous, but it is one way of understanding that. What I'm suggesting is that God's knowledge has, in that justified true belief, the true part of it allows for disjunctions where you can have either ors that once, if they haven't happened yet, they are still true. So this analogy popped into my mind this morning, and I don't know if it's any good. I'll let you guys tell me if you think that it's no good. But we use knowledge. There was a big football game on yesterday that I watched. Unfortunately, it wasn't a very good game. I didn't enjoy it all that much, but I did waste some time watching the game. And so probably that's part of why this analogy is in my mind. But the game of football is a complicated game. And the huddle, they call a play, the quarterback comes up to the line, but most of the time he has in his mind, he knows exactly what he's going to do, but it depends on what he sees from the defense. If the defense is doing one thing, he might call an audible, or if he sees what he likes, he's going to call his play. Nobody would say he doesn't know what he's going to do. But until he actually sees the defense, then what path he's choosing becomes clear. Is it man defense? Is it zone defense? That dictates, am I going to pass? Am I going to run? What are we going to do? So they have multiple options. And of course, this analogy breaks down because football teams can fail and whatever else. But we wouldn't say a quarterback doesn't know what they're going to do. They're very decisive. They come to the line. They know what they're going to do. They have a disjunctive. If it's this, I'm going to do this. If it's this, I'm going to do this. So they know what they're going to do. And in a much greater sense, God knows what he's going to do. And that's exactly what he's laying out. If you obey me, it's this way. If you disobey me, it's this way. And of course, he knows even beyond that of how the longer these things go, eventually things are, unless he intervenes, which of course he can do, but unless he intervenes, he knows the eventual course of how things will go. How long does he want to let that run before he intervenes, before he brings judgment? These are all decisions that he can make. And so my definition doesn't say God doesn't know. It just says that he doesn't know in the same type of way that your foundational definition, which again, neither of these are biblical definitions.
Yeah.
And when we go back to, I think it's Genesis 22, when God tells Abraham, now I know, my definition, I think, fits that better because God, of course, knew that it could go this way or this way. And then when it happens in time, now it goes from the, again, I wouldn't say hypothetical or theoretical, but actual potential, the potential disjunction. It becomes actual in time. And God, of course, knew before that and during that and after that in a way that is infallible. He couldn't be wrong, but his knowledge went from a disjunctive knowledge to the type of knowledge that I think you're...
Absolutely.
This more absolute knowledge that has no disjunctives at all, or the disjunctives are only hypothetical rather than.
It would be interesting. We've heard Joe's definition of knowledge, and I'm not asking you to do it right now, Micah, but it would be interesting for you to generate or provide a definition of knowledge that satisfies its uses biblically. It's all written out,
Yeah.
defined.
So I think that, first of all, I think that when you're talking about knowledge, knowledge is an attribute of God. When you're talking about God's attributes versus creaturely attributes, we have to understand that there's a creator-creature distinction in play. That God's attributes, even though they are imaged in our attributes, are not exactly identical. I think that definition of knowledge as justified true belief is collapsing the creator into the creaturely, and attributing a kind of knowledge to him that is true of creatures. My knowledge certainly is justified true belief. I don't think that's God's kind of knowledge. And then as far as the illustration goes, the quarterback knows what he's going to do. Nobody could say that the quarterback doesn't know what he's going to do. It depends on what the defense gives him. He could audible, he could go ahead with the play as planned, etc. Okay, but that's not what Deuteronomy 31 is saying. Deuteronomy 31 is saying not only that God knows what he's going to do, he knows what the defense is going to do. So the quarterback can't say he knows what the defense is going to do, which is why I think it breaks down.
Well, yeah, it breaks down because in the case of the quarterback doesn't have justified true belief of what the defense is going to do. That's why, yes, of course, that's why it breaks down. So it's not a perfect analogy, but if you could apply that analogy, if there was a way in which you could apply that analogy to what the defense was going to be doing at the same time as the quarterback knows what the offense, you would have that. And so, yes, there is the distinction between the knowledge that a quarterback has and the knowledge that an all-knowing versus limited knowing.
Well, if you, again, I'm not trying to press the analogy because the analogy doesn't matter. You said something very important that I want to get to, but, if you watch, some people didn't like listening to Tony Romo as a commentator because he was always calling out the plays before they happened, because he has a different type of knowledge when he's looking at, like, he does know what the defense is going to do, and he can say it. Now, is he 100% accurate? No, he's way more accurate than I am, way more accurate than most weathermen are when they're trying to do their, like, he knows. And if you have, God's qualitative difference in knowledge, yes, is different than ours, but that I would push back and say, well, what does that mean? Because you discarded what I said, but didn't provide an alternative definition. You just discarded it, saying God doesn't know in the same way we do. I agree. His knowledge is much more complete than ours. Sure. But is it so different that then it's a different model of knowledge, that we don't know in any way the same way that he does, that justified true belief can be true for us, but isn't true for him in any way? Or if it is true for him in some way, if you want to say that the creature is different than the creator, you still need to provide an alternative for us to, and again, I think I know what it is, but to dismiss that and say, well, the creator is different than the creature, sure, I agree. And that's why I think my analogy is weak, but it's not, I don't think it's a wrong analogy. I just think that the degree to which God knows things, he does know our tendency. He knows us even better than we know ourselves. So he could never be wrong in those things. And, we've seen God harden hearts. We've seen God soften hearts. So God can tweak things along the way in ways that make some, libertarian free will people uncomfortable, or in some people that say, well, God can't really know. No, he knows. He is never wrong. But I don't think that my definition of knowledge would say that God ever doesn't know something. He does know it. And even if it is a multiple way, that's not decreasing his knowledge. It's actually expanding his knowledge. I feel like God actually knows more, and the way that you would articulate it, I think, you can tell me if I'm wrong, is that by him articulating that it is theoretically possible that it could go this way, I don't know why that's so much of a leap to say, no, this is actually possible that it could have gone that way. Like, I don't know why there's such a disconnect to say that theoretical, if you had done this, it would have gone this way. Like, that's almost what I'm describing. I'm just saying that it actually could be that way, rather than, theoretically, hypothetically, if I made a circle a square, then a circle would be a square. He's saying you literally could have done this, and this is what it would have been. That's pretty much what I'm articulating, is that it could be that way.
Yeah. So my definition of, and this is something I'm just pulling out of my head right now. So
we're going to hold you to this forever.
You mentioned particulars. I think God's knowledge is not, I'm trying to use a word you'd accept.
And there's very few.
when you're talking about multiples, when you're
there's
talking
11.
about
There's only
multiples,
11 words he's accept.
when you're talking about multiples, you're talking about hypothetical pathways or actual possible, like these are actual
potential
pathways.
pathways.
Pathways. I don't think that God's knowledge is potential. I think it's concrete, absolute of all the particulars.
Well, couldn't you say he has absolute knowledge of all my potential choices?
Not just the potential choices, what will actually come about.
Right. So think of it this way then. If there is one course through history, God knows the actualities of all those things. That's one way of understanding. If there are multiple pathways through, and God knows all of the particulars of every single one of those, he knows what can happen and what can't happen. It's not a limit on his knowledge. It is actually an expansion, or it is just simply a saying, well, okay, God knows. All the Reformed theologians that I've read, like Norman Geiser and Grudem or whatever, these guys on the various parts of the Calvinistic spectrum that talk about divine foreknowledge and knowledge and omniscience and all those kinds of things, they use the types of language saying God knows everything that is actual and everything that is theoretical or impossible, right? And so
the difference though between us talking about what is actual and possible, because I would agree that's a sound distinction. That's a distinction I hold to. God does know everything that's actual, and he knows everything that's possible. But the question, and this is what Reformed theology gives a answer based in God's decree to. The question is, why is something possible? Well, it's God's knowledge of what God could have done. It's God's knowledge of what he could have decreed. It's God's knowledge of how he could have set things up, not his knowledge of. It's not his dependent knowledge upon the creature based upon what they will do.
And if that's the view you hold, there are just many verses in the Bible where that definition is completely obscured by what the Lord himself says.
And let me give you an example that might fall into that category. So this is my view. I sympathize with what you're saying because I think it is logical. I don't think it's not illogical. I mean, it's like I think it was Calvin who said, God foreknows all the future because he's predetermined all the future. Well, that is perfectly logical and makes sense. What my concern though with that is, so I believe that it's not God's foreknowledge that determines the future. It's the future that determines God's foreknowledge. And I will say this, that is not always the case, because there are some passages where God will say, I have predetermined this to happen. This is not dependent on free will at all. I am going to make this happen. And he did. So I just want to set the record straight. I do think that does apply in some situations, and I don't disagree with you. In other words, I don't think everything can be chalked up to free will alone. I think that's absurd. It's not. The Bible does not warrant that. But in Deuteronomy 31, God explains how he knows what these people are going to do. And in Deuteronomy 31, verse 21, it says, "Then it shall come about, when many evils and troubles have come upon them, that this song will testify before them as a witness, for it shall not be forgotten from the lips of their descendants. For I know their intent which they are developing today, before I have brought them into the land which I swore." So he's saying, I foreknow what they're going to do because I know what they're intending to do right now in their hearts. They're developing this plan about what they're going to do. So he gives the explanation for how he knows. And the way that he knows is not his foreordination. It's the determination of the people at that time to rebel against him. And they were even intending to do it like as they're going into the land, it sounds like. I mean, they intended to disobey.
Yeah, and this is a great example of exactly what I was talking about. Many verses for which, if
this is only one,
Micah,
but anyway, this is. I'm sorry, Greg. I didn't mean to.
That's okay, brother. I'm good.
Stiff arm you there, but this is just the point I'm making is that there are times in Scripture where the Bible plainly says God did this. God made this happen. There's a list of passages where it says something happened. It says God did this. God made this happen. But then there are other passages where it says man did this. Like man decided that he was going to do this, and then it happened. So I agree. God foreknew that was going to take place. But I think it was. Go ahead.
Do you think that this is intended to be an explanation of how he knows, not just that he knows? I take this as an explanation that he knows.
Agreed.
I know what this people are inclined to do right now.
Yes.
That's not it's not even trying to answer the question of how he knows this. So
No,
I just don't see this as a problem.
Theology has tried to answer these questions, and we have. This is one of those areas: God's relationship to time, what exactly He knows. These things have been influenced by the philosophy department, and that's where our presuppositions make a huge difference, and they're often hidden. We've on another issue where we probably all maybe isn't as controversial, but I was in the philosophy department, and they love to ask these, I think, ridiculous questions, but of course they think they're very profound and deep. Could God make a rock so heavy that He can't lift it, and all this other silly nonsense that people think is some profound, deep objection to the omnipotence of God. But I'll take the demerits for this. As we're reading, yes, God has all power, but can God do anything? Well, the Bible is very explicit that there are certain things that He can't do. God can't change. God can't lie. God can't deny Himself. So you say, okay, well, the Bible itself tells us 3 things that God can't do. So when we say that God knows everything, does that mean that there is no, do we want to stretch this to the same type of way that people do with omnipotence, for example, saying, well, God can do everything. God can do all things. That means that there's nothing God can't do. Well, the Scripture itself says that there's things that God can't do. And so how did God create the world? It's possible that He did create it in a way, like Eric said, certainly logically possible, that the Calvinistic scheme is correct, that God foreordained everything that shall come to pass, that the Westminster Confession is true, and that's exactly how it is. It's also possible that God made it a different way, that He just looked through the corridors of time and He just made a world where everybody makes the decisions that they make. I happen to reject both of those. I think that God is interacting with His world in a way that is different than either of those, but also does, I think at least, preserve a definition of knowledge, which I agree. This passage and no other passage that we will come to tells us how God knows these things, just tells us that He knows. And so that's why I don't think the open theology people would accept me, because at least what I understand, they think that there are some things that He doesn't know. That is not what I'm saying, and I hope at least nobody gets that. But yeah, the how question is, it's at least interesting to answer because it does then affect how we interpret these. But sorry, Eric, go ahead.
So you guys, you wouldn't say that this is talking about how God knows they're going to disobey. Because it seems to me, as I read this, the whole context is about what they're going to do in the future. The whole context is about that.
When Mike and Joe hear you use the word how, I think they mean by what mechanism, and maybe you don't mean it in that sense.
Well, I mean, the whole passage is talking about what they're going to do later on when they enter the promised land.
Agreed.
And God says, I know that you're going to disobey because I know what you're inclined to do. I know what you're even developing in your minds at this very moment. So it's almost like there's a kind of cause and effect thing.
Sure. Yeah, I think
that's going on here.
To your point, Eric, I think there may have been a disjunction right before God says this, or right before they started scheming in their hearts to do these things. And like every other disjunction we've seen, God knew the potentiality, again, arguing from Joe's perspective, which I agree with. At the point they decided to scheme in their own hearts, that potential knowledge became actual knowledge. And
well, I don't have any issues with that necessarily.
Yeah,
all I'm saying is I think there is a cause and effect going on right here. I think that they're developing.
Basically, what Eric is arguing is that God's foreknowledge depends upon the actions of creatures. Is that what you're saying?
I think in some cases, yes. As I said earlier, there are things that God just predetermines, and He brings it up. Like the Red Sea crossing, and the miracles that happened in Egypt. I mean, God brought those things about.
Okay.
Only to the degree in which God said again of Abraham, "Now I know." Again, how we are defining knowledge impacts, because I think you hear me say that, and you mean God's dependent? Well, no, I think you're still missing the thrust of the definition.
Well, I think God has. I think I guess my thinking is, and I could be wrong, but I think God just makes some of his actions dependent on human actions. So, like, if God says, okay,
If you disobey me, I'm going to strike you.
If you disobey me, I'm going to strike you. If you obey me, I'm going to bless you. God has chosen in his sovereignty to make his actions conditioned upon what the creatures decide to do. Now, does God have to do that way? Absolutely. God absolutely not. God can do it anyway.
Actions and his knowledge of those actions are different things, though. So
true, absolutely they are.
So, and this is more of a question for Eric, because I think we agree on more terms probably that make it. We agree on we're probably pretty closer to the classical terminology that this conversation usually gets had around. So, Eric, how does your view not entail that God learns from his creatures? Because he is dependent for his knowledge of what they will do on them.
So my answer has been, and it's a disappointing answer, but it has been all along. I don't know, and I don't know for sure, because the Bible doesn't necessarily say it, at least not in every case. Now, in some cases it does. God says, I'm going to bring this about in the future. It's predetermined. Okay, we know how it's going to happen. We know how God knows because it's predetermined. But in other cases where it seems to me like human freedom is involved and God has conditioned himself upon human freedom, in those cases, I honestly don't know for sure how God knows ahead of time what that person is going to freely choose to do. So some Arminians, and I don't really hold to this view. I guess it's not impossible. It seems kind of absurd to me right now, but like they'll say, well, he looked through time and he looked into the future and saw what this person was going to do. Well, then I thought, well, did he see what he was going to do in the future? Like, I mean, there's so many.
The future is a created reality. Like, the future is a created reality. History is a created thing. So, like, the he looked down the corridor of time thing has never made any sense to me. Because God, being the independent one, like, there's nothing for him to look at.
It doesn't make any sense to me either. Honestly, I'm like, well, maybe I'm just misunderstanding it. But
so as far as with the I don't know answer. Like, that's a perfectly fine answer for me. There's things that I don't know. I've been playing about those things.
Yeah.
So, like,
I'm just being honest.
Yeah.
So the impressiveness of God, I've said in another episode, and I know at least Eric and Greg were part of that conversation. Mike, I don't think you were. I think that some of these definitions, the particularly the conversation that was going on between Calvin and Arminius, and all their followers at the time, they share a set of presuppositions which I think was a caricature of God that we've been told is the most sovereign God could be, and I think that what I'm advocating for is actually more impressive. I think that this God is more impressive, and I use the different. We don't have to get into all that, but that's where I'm at. And again, I'm not saying that with any hostility, just like I don't think that you're saying it with any hostility, that obviously you are pushing back on some of the definitions that I have. As we're looking here at Deuteronomy 31, as God's talking about the future to come with this people, up until this point, we've seen God's history with them. And so he told Moses that he was going to bring them out. In fact, he told Abraham that he was going to make a people and bring them out. Joseph believed that, and he said, when you come up from here, bring my bones. 400 plus years later, now they bring his bones. Yes, God said, I'm going to do these things, these signs, and I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart when necessary to make sure that I can do all the signs that I want to do. God's able to do it exactly as he wants. Brings them out into the wilderness. But then what happens when they're in the wilderness? Well, there's time when God says, Moses, stand back. I'm going to kill these people, and I'm going to make a generation of you. And Moses intercedes, and it says God relents or changes his mind or repents, depending on which translation we're reading. But I believe that God could have done that. He could have killed everybody, and he would have then brought them in. It just would have been later. He didn't go that route. Instead, he goes this route where then they come up to the land, and most of them reject. And so he kills off that generation, everybody between, not Joshua and Caleb, and then everybody that was over 20 or over 19, and they wait 40 years, and then they go in. But eventually they do go in. And so from this point, in history, they're not in yet. But from this point in history, we could say, well, he's declared, okay, you're going to go into this land. You're going to come out from Egypt. You're going to go into this land. But we were shown, I think, what you would say maybe theoretical or hypothetical or potentially actual. We know the path that they took because that's the one that happened. But it seems like God was declaring there are a bunch of ways that I can do exactly what I said. And so likewise, when he's saying to them that here, I think we're all reading this. We know what happened, but let's keep our eyes out for passages that said that something else could have happened. And would this still be true? Of course. And would it be the generation that God knew? Yes. And would it be in the time that God knew? Yes. But on those disjunctions, that is just less specific in the actual path, but it does include the things that you would agree that God also knows that, yes, it could have gone this way. I don't think that your definition allows that it could have gone this way, that it must go the way that it goes. And all of these other it could have gone this ways are to me, they're just as meaningless as saying, well, God, you could have filled the lands with square circles, but that's not a statement that means anything. I don't view that God would ever be saying something like that because those things don't exist. Those are impossibilities. And so the knowledge that I think that he's saying, does he know this? Yes, of course he does. He's God. And how he knows it, I don't know. He knows things in a way that we can't. But I don't think that my definition, although it pushes up against some presuppositions, it's not like a wholesale getting rid of it. It's more of a tweaking than it might initially seem. And unfortunately, it's been muddied by others who would say that God doesn't know, or he is guessing, or he is completely dependent. He's not. I mean, this is the way that he's made the world. So we're dependent on him. He's not dependent on us. I wouldn't say that he's dependent on us. But that doesn't mean that his interactions with us, his responses with us aren't genuine. So, but again, I every episode seems to kind of really revolve around this. This is probably our biggest, I'm content to talk about this forever, but probably our viewers aren't. So if any of you have a last word on this, I won't say any more on the topic. You can have the last word on it if you'd like. Otherwise, we probably should get to chapter 32 eventually, because we have 3 more chapters to go. But anyway,
I'll take the last word. You guys are wrong.
Delightful.
Says the humble man.
Well, let's get into chapter 32 then. And, there's this song that is being described. We've talked about a theology of song before. I think song is really important to understand. It's and one of the things that's interesting in here, at least stands out to me, is verse 3. I don't really necessarily have a question here, more of an observation. If you guys don't find anything interesting here, we can move on pretty quickly. But verse 3 just simply says, "For I proclaim the name of the Lord, ascribe greatness to our God." This idea of ascribing greatness. God is great. The way I understand this is that then we're just supposed to tell God how great he is. That's part of what our worship is ascribing to him the greatness that is due to his name. And so, things, I listen to a lot of modern worship songs, and a lot of times I feel like I'm singing about myself if I'm singing these words. But this seems to be a different direction. And of course, how God relates to us is wonderful. But when we're praising God and worshiping him, I feel like we should be talking about, God, I don't even know how you know everything, but God, you know everything. That's incredible. Like, I know so little and you know everything. You're great. All your ways are right and true. All my ways lead to death. So thank you for showing me. Just ascribing to him greatness, I think this is so important for what it really means to worship him. But that's how I view it. You guys have any thoughts on that? Like I said, not really a question. I'm interested in your thoughts if you've got them, but otherwise we can move on.
I guess I would just tweak that a little bit. Confessing that God is great. I don't know that it's for the sake of God hearing us say that. Perhaps that's the case. In my mind, I frame it more like me ascribing it, or me confessing it, or me professing it is equally about me reminding myself and me vocalizing it or living that out, manifesting it for other people, so that other people are reminded. So I'm reminding myself, I'm reminding everyone else around me as I do this thing.
I think both of those things fit together. I think you have to ask yourself, like, what is God's chief object of delight? What does God delight the most in? Well, if God is the like maximally glorious being, well, then it would stand to reason that the highest object of his delight is himself. And I think that try not to get any demerits, so I can't go any further with where I was.
You can join me on the demerit train, Micah.
Like, God, the Father and his Son appear to be delighting in one another. Before the incarnation, there's an anticipation of him being at his Father's right hand. What is all these things in the ascension? So if God is the chief object of God's delight, and that is manifested in this relationship between the eternal Father and his eternal Son, if that's the case, then what does he delight in most from his creatures? And what is his creatures' highest reason for existing? Well, it's to delight in him. It's to ascribe greatness to our God. It fits with it fits with the reason that creation exists in the first place.
Well said, a demerit well earned. So, well, a good
Well,
economy of that. Eric, what do you got?
I want to keep this passage in its context because I think the point of ascribing greatness to Yahweh in this passage was to show that Israel's apostasy mentioned throughout the song was totally unjustified and even insane. It's like by ascribing greatness to God, this isn't like an abstract thing. It's like, God, you are great. Look at what you did for us. You brought us out of Egypt. You brought us into the promised land. You blessed us with all these things. And we have rebelled against you. How in the world could we act this way, given how great you are and all that you've done for us? I think this was meant to actually bring more guilt and shame upon them because of all the goodness that God had shown them, because of his greatness. So I think there's actually maybe more of a specific reason for this in this particular section. And so that was my thought.
I think that's a good point. Appreciate that. Moving on a little bit later in this song, we talked about back in chapter 14, verse 1. Greg, you brought it up, I think, this significance and this uniqueness of God declaring, you are the sons of the Lord your God. That was seemingly the first time that specific phrase was used. And then here in this song, in verse 5, it includes this phrase saying they are not his children because of their defect. How do you understand this statement? And verse 6 says something similar, using that language again. Is he not your father who bought you? So any thoughts about this? I mean, we talked about it before. Any new thoughts now as we're seeing this song?
I think verse 20 sheds some light on the language here. It says, for they are a perverse generation, sons in whom is no faithfulness. So they were sons, I think, in the sense that God originally claimed them as his people. They were the people of God, but their unfaithfulness put them out of God's favor, or put them outside of God's favor. And so I guess it's like you can be a son in one sense, but not in another sense. Like to be in the biblical sense, you are the son of whoever you're following. So if you're, for example, if you're following the devil, then you're a son of the devil. If you're following God, you're a son of God. It's like your pattern of life determines whose son you are. And so in this case, it's like he's saying, I did claim you as my people. And so in that sense, you are sons, or you were sons, or whatever. But because you just have not followed me, you haven't trusted me, you've just constantly rebelled, I can't really, like, you're false sons. Because you're not imitating me, you're not following after me.
Yeah, and I think to maybe to highlight or to reinforce that point, I think we ought to take a look at the type of literature we're dealing with, and instead of trying to read this with an excessive degree of literalness, I think we ought to read it literarily. This is a poem. This is a song. The things that are said within this aren't. They are communicating true literal ideas, but they are not always to be taken literally. Like, for example, verse 13, and he made him to suck honey from the rock. Like, I don't recall any point in which honey's being sucked out of rocks, but the provision there is a true provision, and all that goes along with that. And so, were they literally not sons? Again, to Eric's point, I don't think the literalist of not sons is a contradiction with the today you are the sons of the Lord your God. And so the type of literature ought to play a part in how we understand what's being said, reinforcing Eric's point.
And I agree with that, and that's why I think that this essentially is accusing them of something similar to spiritual adultery. Obviously, the imagery is different, but oftentimes Israel will be accused of harlotry or spiritual adultery. Perhaps this is a way of communicating that, but with the image of the father-son relationship. Later on in this song, In verse 8, when the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. But the Lord's portion is his people, and Jacob is his allotted heritage. So there's this idea within the song that they're his treasured possession, they're his inheritance, and that reflects on what it means to be sons of God here, but they're not acting as such. I think that's probably it's obviously it's a song, it's poetry. I don't think that it's saying that they're no longer the sons of God in any sense, like they're no longer set apart or anything like that. I don't think that's what it's saying. um I think you have to take it within its the type of literature that it is, as well as I think verse 9 really sheds light on it, his intention for them to be his inheritance, his allotted heritage.
Yeah. So, what does verse 8 mean when it says that that is God, that he set the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the sons of Israel? I just found this to be a really curious statement, and it really got me thinking about. Actually, it really got me thinking about God's sovereignty and his foreknowledge. So, what did you guys? I don't know if you guys got a chance to look at this, but this was a very curious passage for me.
Yeah. So there are different manuscripts that say different things here. Sons of Israel is what some manuscripts say. My little footnote here says the Dead Sea Scroll, Septuagint, and Masoretic texts say sons of Israel. So he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of Israel. Other manuscripts say sons of God. Now, obviously, that really changes the I think that changes the import of this. How I read this, if it is to be read sons of God, I think that there are certain authorities and territories that were given to angelic beings in the creation of the world. Certain administrations that were given to angelic heavenly beings, and I think that there's other portions of scripture that reflect on that I'm not going to touch on right now because it's going to get me into hot water. But that's how I read this.
Yeah, if that's the case, if that variant, and I don't have a note to that in my Bible, but if that variant is, it would be an interesting addition because of the otherwise rare use of the sons of God language in the Old Testament. So be interesting. So I interpret it by what my Bible has in it, and so according to the number of the sons of Israel, my guess is that this is in reference to this promise being the promise to give Abraham a land was an intention of God's even prior to declaring it to Abraham. So as the sons of Adam or as the sons of man moved around and split apart and started staking out territory, God knew that this particular territory was going to be reserved for something that was going to happen in the future with the sons of Israel. And so that's how I interpret it.
Yeah, I mean, Micah, your point that you were making a few minutes ago, and then what everybody else is saying, aside from the potential variant, the Septuagint does say angels of God. So that is curious. I never caught that before this conversation, and so I appreciate you bringing that up. I'd want to think a lot more about that, but I've always thought about this much more in lines of the terms of what you guys were describing, and then Micah, you had brought it up, but the next verse about this being God's inheritance is what usually grabs my attention, and so it seems to me that God made this people for himself and that he wants them to glorify his name, and that eventually, promises that he's made to Abraham and all along, that eventually all the families of earth will know that there is a God in Israel and will worship him. And so, a lot of times we think about what we get. A lot of this has been about, the land that they're going to get and how God has blessed them and benefited them. And he has set these things clearly. Eric, as you were mentioning, his sovereignty is on display. I don't think that's any less true if he's now describing not just peoples, but even the angels. I mean, that's, showing that God is sovereign over all things, both the material and the spiritual realms. But then this idea that these people are his always just stands out to me. And, the typical man-centered view, just like what I was saying before about a lot of our worship songs seems like we're singing about ourselves, but this is supposed to ascribe greatness to God. Likewise, God is doing this for himself, like he's making these people for him. And that's part of, I'm not trying to drag us back into our other conversation that we were just having, but it just seems to me that, God wants this to go a certain way. And when he expresses anger because it doesn't go a certain way, to think that he sovereignly foreordained that it would go this way, that would drag his name through the mud and stuff like that. That doesn't seem like the path that he would make happen. It does seem like something he's willing to allow happen, and he will work to glorify his name, but his desire seems to be these people as his inheritance. He wants them to act like his children. He's not secretly ordaining that they won't act like his children. Like, he wants them to honor him, to glorify him, and he's doing this for his sake. He's made them for himself. So sometimes people, well, what does God get out of this? Well, I think he's telling us right here, this is what God gets out of it. And when they don't act accordingly, that sure explains to me why it seems like God's pretty upset about it. So seeing his sovereignty, how he could have forced it, but the fact that he chose them for his sake is what usually stands out to me. I don't know if you guys have any other thoughts on that, but I sure do want to look into the potential angel thing more, because that one had missed my radar until this very moment. So my curiosity has been piqued.
Yeah, I think I actually prefer what the NASB says when it says that he set the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the sons of Israel. I think Israel fits better with the context, for one, because this is about Israel going into the land and taking possession of their inheritance. And the second thing is, in the passage itself, it says when the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, it's likening God giving Israel their inheritance to God giving these other nations their inheritance. So I think that fits better with the context. I think what he's saying is that when God separated the peoples of the world and placed them in their designated locations, he also chose land for Israel based on their population. And when the Canaanites became ripe for judgment, God intended to bring them into the land to take possession of it. We know that God intended to do that hundreds of years beforehand when he mentioned that to Abraham. So I think Israel is a better fit with the context. But I did read in some commentaries that that the angel view that Micah gave that was definitely in the list of possible interpretations.
If that is, I mean, not that I can talk about it, because I'm not going to earn myself a demerit today, but that could potentially fit with some things that we hear elsewhere that we'll read in the future. I don't know that I prefer one or the other. I only know, like, again, my Bible didn't have that note, and so I was perfectly willing to accept what was there. But I wouldn't rule out the other. I'd like to know what was originally written, so I could interpret based upon that, not upon which I prefer.
Yeah. Well, the issue is an interesting one. I have nothing else to add, so I'm just going to move us on if that's all right with you guys. But I'm most interested in Micah's response to this, because it is related. Of course, if you guys, the other of you, are not forbidden from any thoughts, but as I read verses 19 through 22 in this song, there is language that seems like God is very clearly responding to actions that he saw them do. So, for example, verse 19 says, "The Lord saw this and spurned them because of the provocation of his sons and daughters." So at least the language that is here says God saw their activities, that activity provoked him, and then God responded, and it carries on, in this section. And so if you don't view it as God responding to them, I'd just be curious to hear how you read something like this.
I think this probably gets us into territory where the horse is already dead. But I will say how I view it. I don't think that my view rules out God responding to things in time. Even though it is going to go a certain way, I don't think that rules out God responding to things in time, or being provoked by things in time. Once again, I still think human beings are responsible for their actions. I still think sin is heinously evil and dreadful. So I still think God responds in time. God responding to things in time is one of the ways that his decrees are actually carried out. So, yeah, I don't really have much. I'm sure that's probably how you were all anticipating me to answer that.
Yeah.
I don't really have much more to add to it.
Would you say something along the lines of this is like a secondary causation where like the initial primary causation was God's decretive will before the foundation of the world, but then as these things are acting out, that then God is saying, because of what you did, I'm doing this, but they did what they did because of God's decree. Like, would you object to any of that?
Secondary causes, I did, like, most of the Reformed confessions talk about things, God's decrees, God decreeing things to fall out according to secondary causes. So what that means is that God not only decrees the end, but the means as well. So yeah, I think that what you're looking at right here is means. And I don't think that they're an illusion. I don't think that they're fake. I think they're real. But they're means to achieving God's ultimate purposes.
Do you understand why that's just a difficult pill for me to swallow, to think that God would have ordained them to do something that then God says is a provocation to him? Like he made them do this, and then he's provoked by what they did, even though he's the one that made them do it.
I don't like the language of made them as in forced their hand. I think there's like in the Reformed literature, they want to draw a distinction between God being the first cause of something and him forcing somebody's hand into something.
But if he ordained it, I mean, like he determined it.
But I think one of the reasons that you'd find that to be a tough pill to swallow is because it would seem to make all of this an illusion, and the provocation there to not actually be real provocation, something like along those lines. That's probably the objection that would pop. One of the objections that would pop into your mind.
Would you agree that at least on the surface, if you didn't have the benefit of all your theological training, if you're just reading this, that it does sound like God is responding to what they did? Like a lot of this other stuff you're talking about, in the Reformed literature and all these other explanations, we're not seeing anything about a decree of will. What we're seeing is this part of the process, that they did something and it made God angry, and then he did something in response. Does that not seem to be the plainest reading of this to you?
God is responding. I do agree that God is responding.
Okay.
I just think it's in that order of causes or means. So once again, there's an element of this that I can't fully say that I understand how it all fits together. I have two sets of data that I have to try to work with. I have texts that appear to me to refer to a decretive will of God, and I have texts where God is interacting with his creatures in time, in service of accomplishing his purposes. I don't think it's real. I don't think it's not real. I don't think it's an illusion. I don't think it's fake. I don't think the provocation here is fake. I don't think any of those things. Once again, I'm a creature. I can't fully reconcile those two sets of data.
I have one last question for you, and then I'll stop. But would you put, like Deuteronomy 31 that we were just talking about, would you put that in the category of texts that are describing the decretive will of God?
I don't think it's the strongest possible text.
Have we encountered any yet that are? Because maybe I'm just forgetting, or are we still kind of anticipating?
Not when I was here.
We're anticipating this list of these strong decretive statements somewhere later in Scripture. And I'm not trying to fish for a demerit for you.
Much of it, I would say probably is yet to come. But I do think you see certain things. I think that you see hints at it, for instance, with Joseph and his brothers. I think that there are hints of it. I think that it's one of those things, by the way, that gets stronger, and the light grows as you walk through progressive revelation.
And the argument. Oh, never mind. All right.
You guys have other thoughts on this? Again, I wasn't exclusively interested in Micah's opinion, just mostly interested in Micah's opinion, if that makes sense. Because I know he and I at least view it very differently. So, you guys have other thoughts to add, or shall we press on?
Let's press on. We're going to end up beating a dead horse.
Okay. So in 32:48 to 52, we see a bit of a glimpse of mercy in the midst of judgment. Moses is allowed to see the land from a distance, but he had pleaded with God. God's still firm. He's not allowed to go in, but he does get to see it. And then there's also this phrase about the death of Moses, that he's going to be gathered to his people, which seems to speak of some sort of afterlife reality. Maybe not. Maybe that's just how we're reading it because we have the rest of Scripture, but that seems to be what's going on. Any thoughts that you guys have about this? I've heard some people say that the Old Testament is shockingly silent about some idea of an afterlife. I don't think that that's true personally, but am I reading too much into this, or do you guys read that differently?
Well, my first comment is on God showing Moses the promised land from a distance, and I actually found this to be pretty touching. It's almost like God was saying, "I can't let you enter because of your sin against me, but I very much appreciate you leading my people for all this time. I want you I want you to be able to go in." Because of all that you've done, but for now, I can only show you from a distance, and so it's almost like an acknowledgement that Moses did well in leading the people of God, and that's kind of the way that I took it. Now, as far as the question about the afterlife, at first I thought being gathered to your people meant be buried with your ancestors, and then I realized, well, that's obviously not what it's saying. The context rules that out. In verse 6, it says that he buried him in the valley, in the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor, but no one knows his burial place to this day. Well, if Moses was buried in a family tomb, then everyone would have known where his burial place was, because it would have been in the family tomb. So be gathered to your people has to mean something else. And the only other thing that I think it could mean is be gathered to the souls of other righteous people. I'm open to different interpretations, but to me, that seemed like by process of elimination, the one that made the most sense.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. I would say something like it's a vague reference to an afterlife or to something beyond. The thing that I found most interesting is it seems like there is a built-in distinction between you are going to go and be gathered to your people as Aaron, your brother, died and was gathered to his people. These are brothers, right? They're why wouldn't their people be the same people? And so maybe I'm making too much of that. You're going with your people, and he went with his people. Maybe those are the same people, but why not? Just as your brother Aaron was gathered to your people. And so is this a colloquialism? Is this trying to give us some insight into an afterlife? I'm not exactly sure.
Are you insinuating that Aaron was maybe not saved, or like what?
No. That's what I'm saying is I would have expected God to say, you're going to be gathered to your people, just like your brother Aaron was gathered to your people. And so why am I making too much of that? Is the distinction there in the original Hebrew? I have no idea. So it caught me by surprise.
Interesting. Micah, any thoughts?
I have nothing to add. I think it's probably a vague reference to the afterlife too, just because of how the death takes place. But
fair enough. Well, in chapter 33, then let's move on. I remember once I was witnessing, and this guy he was really excited to ask me this question. He goes, "Do you know where God comes from?" I was like, "What? What's that?" He goes, "Do you know where God comes from? People want to know where God comes from." I know. Do you know? The Bible says. I was like, okay, just tell me. And he then gave me it wasn't a reference to this passage, but a passage like this, God came from Sinai. Like there's this geographical place like that God comes
God's
from
house,
there. That's
his house is
so
in
like,
Sinai.
Sometimes people, non-believers, would be like, well, who made God, right? And you go, okay. I put that in the same category of, can God make a rock so big that he can't lift it? So where did God come from? Sometimes people read passages like this, these geographical statements. God came from these places as the origin of God. That doesn't seem to be what's going on. What is being said with a geographical type of thing? It says God came from Sinai and dawned on them from Seir. Talking about God's coming from these geographical places. How should we understand this language if we're not saying that this is the origin of God himself, that God actually comes? I mean, some gods might, right? False gods might come from that place, that they actually are created in these lands where people worship them. But that's not, at least how I read these passages. Curious to hear your thoughts.
I just kind of thought it was talking about God's journeying with them in the wilderness. I don't think this is talking about where God's address is. And so if you go back to Deuteronomy chapter 2, and I don't know for sure if this is exactly what's in mind with this, but in Deuteronomy 2, verse 1, it says, "Then he turned and set out for the wilderness by the way to the Red Sea, as the Lord spoke to me, and circled Mount Seir for many days. It sounds like it's just simply talking about God going with them, leading them, in the wilderness. Sinai is where God gave the law. He actually came and settled on the mountain, and then after that was done, Israel went elsewhere. God led them elsewhere. I don't know. Maybe I'm looking at this in a too simplistic kind of a way, but
This is about revelation, not origin. It's not talking about an origin of God. It's talking about how he revealed himself to his people. Notice all the different verbs that are used here. He came from Sinai. Then it says he dawned from Seir upon us. And then it says shone forth from Mount Paran, and then came from the 10,000s of holy ones with flaming fire at his right hand. It's clearly about how he manifested his presence to his people. It's absurd to think that it's anything else.
And I would only add to that, I don't know, I didn't want to call somebody absurd,
Case closed.
But fair enough. I probably agree. I just wouldn't want to say it out loud. I'd say we're also, again, dealing with poetry. So let's treat poetry. If we were dealing with poetry anywhere outside of the Bible, we wouldn't feel the need to read it with this overly wooden, literalistic interpretation. And so applying that, I completely agree with everything Micah said. But wouldn't call people absurd out loud. I'd think it.
Thank you for your thoughts. I'm in agreement. This is not about origin. I wasn't winning that. I wasn't winning that bad. That guy definitely thought that the Lord came. His take was from Teman. We'll see that one much later. But anyway, we can move on.
Yeah, he's probably one of those guys that believes the Nephilim went to other planets too, and they're waiting to come back. Anyway,
if I meet him again, I will ask him that question if I meet him again.
Yeah, I already know the answer he'll give. But anyway,
how do you know?
Because I'm him. No, I'm not.
I'm Batman moment.
The big reveal. Anyway, on to more important things. My question is, the chapter includes Moses' blessing for the tribes of Israel. And as I was reading this, it just occurred to me that this is in some ways similar to the blessings that Jacob gave in Genesis 49. For example, how is it different? Well, just as one example, I noticed that Moses refers to Dan as a lion's whelp in Deuteronomy 33:22, while Jacob refers to Judah as a lion's whelp in Genesis 49:9. Greg made an observation, and a crown is for Joseph rather than a scepter for Judah. So what are your guys' thoughts on this? Is this meant to be the same kind of thing as Deuteronomy 49? Is it different? What are your guys' thoughts?
I think it's different, at least in the respect that the original one is speaking to individuals, and this is speaking to tribes of people. So the target audience is a different target audience. The context is a different context. So I guess I wouldn't be trying to harmonize those or have difficulty if they don't harmonize perfectly. And I would also want to look at, I think it's my impression that Moses's blessing is, while it is individualized, it is more a corporate blessing necessarily than what was happening, what we saw in earlier in the text.
Yeah, I am just like Micah. I don't really know. It's a very interesting question, Greg. I mean, everything you're saying sounds, I wouldn't take issue with anything you said. The only thing I would add, I remember us having what I thought was an interesting conversation, particularly when we were talking about Genesis 49 about verse 24, because there is this it's a perplexing statement in the blessing to Joseph there. The New American Standard says, from there is the shepherd, the stone of Israel. And then now here, as Greg, you were pointing out, that there's a crown for Joseph rather than a scepter for Judah. I don't really know what to fully make of those. I remember us having an interesting conversation before. I'm not fully settled myself, and so I don't know fully what to make of them personally, so I'll just stop there.
Well, I just noticed that it seemed to me like Genesis 49 was intended to be more prophetic, whereas this chapter we're looking at is just sort of like Moses simply asking God to bless the people. So the one, Jacob, seemed to be more so acting as a prophet, whereas Moses is more so acting like as just a mediator, like, God, please bless these people. So that was the main observation that I made.
Fair enough. Why don't you take us into chapter 34?
Sure. Well, we've talked about the authorship of the Torah in past episodes, and this chapter records the death of Moses, implying that someone other than Moses wrote it. That's at least the implication. And verse 10 sounds like maybe the author lived a while after Moses. It says, since that time, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses. So it just the natural reading seems to me like someone other than Moses wrote this. So I'll be the first to say I am a Bible-believing Christian. I believe the Bible is true. Some Christians really stress the importance of Mosaic authorship, and they'll go so far as to say Moses wrote every single thing in the Torah, Genesis through Deuteronomy, and if you say anything differently than that, no matter how subtle or minor, then you're denying the Bible or something. So my question is, are we as Bible-believing Christians obligated to believe that Moses wrote literally everything in the Torah, or is there another view that is acceptable for Christians to hold? What do you guys think?
Say that the text doesn't tell us you have to believe that, and so I wouldn't want to legalistically come behind and make that a rule. I have absolutely no problem believing that while Moses wrote the bulk, I don't have any reason to take away that he didn't exclusively write every single word.
Most views of Mosaic authorship that I've, like, even strong, scholarly, Bible-believing, inerrancy-affirming, scholarly opinions that I've read would hold to something like substantial Mosaic authorship, or something like basically the enormous mass of the Torah. Aside from certain very minimal editorial remarks here and there, are Mosaic. And that would fit just fine with Jesus referring to the Torah as Mosaic in origin. There's no contradiction there. The rest of the Bible, assuming that, yeah, that's a demerit.
Okay.
The rest of the Bible, assuming, but that's what we're talking about, is an apologetic issue. The rest of the Bible, assuming Mosaic authorship, there's no contradiction there. If there is an inspired, some sort of inspired scribe that was basically like, this is how Moses died, and basically summing up the whole thing. No one's ever arisen in Israel like him. It does not, like, there's no sense in which that would denigrate the Mosaic authorship of the Torah. It's common sense. And also, could God have inspired Moses to write this if he wanted to? Yeah, he could have. So,
that wouldn't be my
fine.
argument, but yeah, Moses writes the majority of it, and someone comes along and writes an epilogue. Does that change the fact that Moses wrote the book? No, absolutely not.
Yeah, I mean, it is a very ungenerous standard from those who are being hypercritical to think. I mean, you could find many books probably on your shelf right now that are written by an author, have that person's name on it. It's referred to as the work of that person, that maybe there's a postscript or an afterword that's written by somebody else. That doesn't change the authorship of the sum and substance of the book, and certainly to refer to that book that may or may not have some other words in a very minimalistic type way as being a work of anyone other than, that particular author. Micah, you hit the other one that I've heard, because Eric's question is, is there other views? I've heard maybe more. I won't put labels on them, but for those who want to say, no, Moses actually did write every single word, and they don't even want to allow for some sort of postscript editor or any kinds of additions later. Certainly, God could have, because of the fact that He knows the future, He could have inspired Moses to write exactly things that happened after his death. These things are immediately after his death, and then for a long time after his death, and God was already, we already discussed things. God was having them write a song to talk about things that were going to happen well after Moses' death. So is that impossible for God to do? No. Is that what I think happened? No, I think probably Joshua or maybe somebody else kind of wrote this this postscript at the end. But, to go to throw away Mosaic authorship because of this final, this like brief section at the end, that's a bridge too far for me. I can't get on board with those who would question Mosaic authorship, because even if somebody else wrote this part.
I agree with you guys, and I don't have anything substantial to add. I would just say that sometimes Christians fight battles that they just don't need to be engaged in.
Really? I've never noticed.
Well, there's
company excluded, of course, right?
Of course.
Yeah.
It's like, well, in order to maintain the integrity of Scripture, we have to say that God, gave Moses this revelation about his death and then had him write it before he died. It's like, it's a battle that you don't need to fight. Like, it's okay if Moses didn't write this. Do we agree that he wrote the majority? Yes, we agree with that. I mean, the Bible plainly says that Moses wrote the majority of it. So I'm fine with saying.
And if Joshua wrote it, does that make it any less like Joshua being the next man whom the Spirit of God rested upon and as leader? If Joshua led it, are we suddenly in turmoil? Like, what are we arguing about?
No turmoil for me.
Silliness.
Yeah. Well, our final question before we conclude, not just our conversation today, but our conversation on the book of Deuteronomy. We do see this amazing description of Moses' death, which you've already alluded to it. Eric, you mentioned it already, but there's a statement that he was buried, at least the way I read it, by God himself. You guys have any thoughts about this just amazing declaration about the end of Moses' life? This is quite the transition point in the people of God. Man, if God really buried Moses, which is what I read, that seems pretty significant. Any thoughts you guys have before we say goodbye for today?
Nothing other than commenting on the extreme brevity of such a peculiar act of God burying one of his prophets. I mean, it just says it, and then says almost nothing else. Says nothing else about it. And I don't know. That's just amazing to me.
I would say that brevity maybe has something to tell us. Like, listen, was Moses a great guy? Yes. Was Moses a prophet? Yeah. But this isn't about Moses. It's about what God's doing. And so, if at the end my tombstone just says faithful, okay, sounds good. I'm perfectly content with that.
Yeah, it is very anticlimactic. It is, especially since this is the leader of Israel, and he's really the first leader of Israel, and we'll as we read on, a name that's just mentioned for thousands of years to come. But I think that the fact that that it says that God buried him, it's almost like, how much more do you need to say? If God's the one that did that, that's quite an acknowledgement, and that's quite an act where it's very honoring to Moses. And so I think if I die and God buries me, nothing more needs to be. It's not going to happen, by the way. But I'm just saying that's all that needs to be said. If that's all that's said, wow, that is a considerable thing to mention.
Amen. Well, that's going to be it for us today. That's what we think. What do you think? We'd love to read your comments below. Do you agree with us? Do you disagree with us? Do you have questions you want to ask? You have stones you want to throw? You can feel free to do all those wonderful things and more down in the comments section below. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to click the thumbs up button. That helps us to show YouTube that our content is worthwhile, and maybe they'll show it to some other people. Maybe you could share it with other people. If you don't want to rely on YouTube to do it, you can share it with people, and that'd be just fine by us. If you haven't hit the subscribe button, that'd be great too, or not. Any of those things are fine. But until we see you again, friends, we do hope that you will get equipped, that you'll obey your King, and that you'll glorify your God.
Case closed.
How do you know?
Because I'm him. No, I'm not.